term is making deals. And there's probably three that come to mind. There's obviously the normalization of the relationship with Cuba, the Iran deal, as well as the landmark Paris Accord. What's the secret to making a good deal internationally? And how important are those personal relationships that you have around the globe able to enable those deals to get done?
Well, look, in each of those cases, I think there are a couple of factors at work. Number one is having enough of a sense of history to understand the interests and fears of whoever's on the other side of the table. To have a sense of what is motivating them and how do they think about the world, and what's the story they're telling themselves. So you take the case of Iran, for example. You know, we took advantage of the opportunity of an election that had seen the rejection of President Ahmadinejad, who was famous for his anti-Semitic harangues and anti-Israel pronouncements, and who was a very erratic guy who loved to stir up the most extreme elements of Iranian society. And he was replaced by a guy named, I'm having a senior moment, President Rouhani, who and his foreign minister Zarif, who, although were no friends of the West and no friends of the United States, signaled an interest on the part of the Iranian people for a less intemperate, more moderate, more practical approach, and an interest in figuring out how to rejoin the world community and be less isolated. So we were able to take advantage of that change to explore whether or not they'd be prepared to make a deal. And our interest was making sure they didn't have a nuclear weapon. Their interest was being able to free themselves of the sanctions that we had organized and to improve the economy so that they could show their voters that things had gotten better. But they were also operating under some constraints, which was if it looked like they caved to us, that would strengthen the hardliners inside of Iran. The point being that I had to pay as much attention to what are they thinking, what are their interests, what are their constraints, what are their suspicions. It was useful for me to know, for example, that it is a fact that the CIA helped to undermine a previously elected democratically elected Iranian government. So as a consequence, even those who did not like the theocracy of Iran weren't particularly fond of the United States. And it was important, obviously, for us to also understand what our constraints were back home. And we had to prove that if we made a deal with Iran, it was one that was verifiable and was bulletproof to the inevitable criticism of those who didn't want to see a resolution of this problem, in part because their preference would be that at some point the United States engages in some sort of action that would replace the existing Iranian regime. And that, I think, is probably the most important thing of getting any agreement. It's not unique to politics, it's similar in business. You got to know what the other person's bottom line is and what motivates them. I would also say that, for example, in the Paris Accord, what was important to know was the fact that the Chinese government, their number one concern at all times is stability and making sure that you don't have uprisings or China starts breaking apart, because historically that's been a theme. China is strong when it's cohesive, but it also has all these centrifugal forces that pushes it apart. And so the government is constantly nervous about stability inside the country. It's part of what makes them an authoritarian government. And what we were aware of is the fact that this may still be true, it was true when I was president, the single most visited website in China was the Air Quality Index that the U.S. Embassy put out every morning, because people couldn't breathe and kids were getting cancer. And you were starting to see a coalescence of environmental movements, very quiet, more like consumer movements or safety campaigns inside of China than they were overtly political, but it meant that the Chinese government was very concerned about the environment and were prepared to make some hard decisions. That gave us an opportunity then to reach out and say, look, we're the 2 largest carbon emitters in the world, and if we could get that deal, that in turn would allow us to leverage India and Brazil and other countries that might have wanted to sit on the sidelines. So, so knowing other people's interests helps, and then luck is useful, and hard work and doing your homework. Yeah.
Mr. President, let's go to the next photo that we have. It's a shot here. It's actually your first term in office. You are there in the Oval Office. I think you're surrounded, if I have it correct, you've got Rahm Emanuel there, who went on to become the mayor of Chicago, David Axelrod and others.
Yeah.
Now I have to ask you about Rahm. Is it true that he had like maybe the worst potty mouth of all time?
It is true. I once said, Rahm had an accident when he was a teenager. He was working at a deli, and he sliced off this finger, so he only has like half a finger, half a middle finger. And we used to say that it almost rendered him mute. Rahm can curse, no doubt. Now, I will say that within the confines of the Oval Office, I have been known to curse also. I am not blameless. There were times where you just need to vent a little bit so that you could be the cool, no drama Obama on the outside. There were times where you had to be, Luther the anger translator on the inside.
There's nothing wrong with that. When you think about assembling your first team, what were the types of people that you wanted to surround yourself with?
It's interesting. People ask me a lot about leadership and what are the qualities of putting together an effective organization. And it's a cliche that it's the people that matter and the organizational culture that you build. A couple of things that I found to be most important. Number one was integrity. People being there for the right reasons. And one of the advantages I had is that I had established in our first campaign a set of principles about integrity and how we do things and how we don't do things. And basically, if you want to be part of my campaign, and that included donors and elected officials, whoever it was, if you wanted to be part of our campaign, it had to be because you believed in the mission, not because you wanted something. And so by the time we got into office, we had kind of weeded out the mercenaries and the folks who were in it for the money or the appointments or the business, or they just weren't there anymore because we'd said, that's not how we roll, that's not how we play. And that became very important. Number two was not being afraid to have people who are smarter than you in the room. Because I think that...
By the way, I live that every day. I'm okay with it.
Yeah, there is no way for somebody who is the head of a large organization, certainly not the head of the largest, most powerful organization on earth at the time, maybe not in numbers, but certainly in influence. You can't be an expert on everything. I was mentioning the Iran deal. Part of the reason that we got it done was because I had appointed, as the head of the Department of Energy, a guy named Ernie Moniz, who was an MIT physicist and an expert on nuclear power. So I said, Ernie, if you think this works, I'm willing to sign up for it, but if you don't, we won't. That's not an evaluation I could make, but I had Ernie Moniz in the room, and I also made it a habit of not being embarrassed to say, I don't know what you're talking about. Please explain in English what you are saying. Which is I always tell this to Michelle and I, we always say this to our daughters. If you don't know, please ask. It does not make you look smarter to sit there and nod. Sooner or later, it will be discovered that you don't know what was being talked about. So I made that a good habit. I would not leave the situation room or some big meeting. Until you can explain it to me, then we're not going anywhere. So I think that was the second principle. And then just two others that I'd mentioned, a diversity of views, which doesn't always match up perfectly with a diversity of people in terms of how they look. But I will say this, if you have no women in your meetings, then you are probably not a very good organization. If in this day and age you don't have some racial diversity and the perspectives of those who maybe know what it's like to be on the outside looking in, you're probably going to be missing the boat somewhere, and you'll have some unpleasant surprises. So now that also applies, by the way, in a liberal environment or a progressive environment. If you are in your own echo chamber, where everybody is politically woke and eats granola and drives Priuses, and you're putting together energy policy, and you have nobody in the room who might point out that some guy needs to drive 50 miles to the job and can't afford to trade in his truck for a Prius, so we better be thinking a little bit about gas prices or how this affects ordinary people. That's a kind of diversity as well that sometimes is missing. And if you are able to build a team of integrity with different perspectives that can go at a problem in a respectful way, arguing, debating, digging in, poking, prodding, the likelihood of you performing well, I think, is better. Now, people also just have to be competent. Right? So all that's good, but you know, I always used to quote a line from a movie, The Departed, Martin Scorsese. Anybody remember that movie? Yeah, it's got Jack Nicholson and anyway, Mark Wahlberg plays this cop, and they're chasing somebody, and somehow the guy who's doing surveillance loses the guy, and Wahlberg's furious and saying, you know, what happened? And the guy looks up and says, "Who are you?" And Wahlberg says, "I'm the guy doing my job, you must be the other guy." And I always used to quote that to my team. Don't be the other guy, do your job. And so there are just certain basic criteria in terms of doing your job that are advisable in putting together a team.
Mr. President, I want to single out one member of your cabinet that was there from the beginning right to the end. And I have to say it was probably one of the most special moments that I witnessed in your presidency. And that's when you surprised your Vice President, Joe Biden, with the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
That was fun.
There's no question, at least from his reaction, that you caught him off guard.
Yes, we surprised him. That was a good one.
And I've got to think, I mean, you ran against each other for the nomination. You obviously went on to become president, and you asked Joe Biden to be your vice president. He had 30 plus years in Congress, lots of international work. What did it mean for you to have someone like that by your side?
Well, Joe's a good example of what I just described. You know, he complimented me. He looked at the world and approached certain problems with a different set of experiences. But he had integrity. And he was a big-hearted person and a loyal person. And we shared a common set of values. So it was useful for me to have somebody who wasn't a clone, but could say, Mr. President, you know, here's how it looks like to me, or I've known that guy for a long time. Here's how I advise you approach him. And he was, I think, as good of a partner and vice president as anybody could have hoped for.
No question. No question. Why don't we go to the next photo on the screen? You recognize these two guys?
There you go.
Yeah. So 8 years in office, you had to work with, or had the opportunity to work with two prime ministers, Prime Minister Harper, and of course our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. What was it like working with both those individuals?
One of the why is everybody starting to laugh? You should be accustomed by now to these pauses that I have. They don't mean anything. It's this weird way I talk, which is why people are able to imitate me on late night comedy shows. My mother used to ask, because I started talking like this around the age of 13, she's all, why do you talk like that? You talk like Gary Cooper or somebody. You're this young black kid. Where did you get this way of talking? Now, both Stephen and Justin I've had terrific relationships with, partly because the United States and Canada, let's face it, I mean, we're cousins, we're family. My brother-in-law is from Burlington. You guys go down there, half the time we don't even know you're Canadian. Sometimes you don't tell us. You're just kind of, lurking around. Americans come up here when they get too frustrated with stuff. So we are so tightly bound together culturally, economically, across every dimension, that It is inevitable that our governments reflect that goodwill and spirit. And look, politically, I was obviously more aligned with Justin than I was with Stephen. But in the years where Stephen and I overlapped, we cooperated on a whole range of issues. He was an important ally and partner in international forums around a whole host of issues. And when Justin came into office, I saw him as the inheritor of a proud progressive tradition that is not just Canadian, but is international. And those voices are, I think at a time when, as I mentioned earlier, the basic notion of liberal Western democracies, at a time when those are being challenged, I think Justin represents a reaffirmation of those values. Now, that also doesn't mean, by the way, that both of them did not have very parochial Canadian interests at heart. So there would be long arguments, irrespective of ideology, around Canadian timber. If I had to have one more meeting with Canadians about timber, because frankly, from the United States perspective, we're not spending that much time thinking about timber. I wasn't poring over the timber charts in the Oval Office, and I'd show up in Ottawa, and it's like, well, let's have a 2-hour meeting on timber. And I was all like, why? Can't somebody else solve this? I've got Afghanistan, Iran, climate change. Timber's what I gotta talk about. So you do have that whole Canadian thing. Certain things are really important to you that nobody cares about. But it's okay. It's okay.
Well done. You just insulted us and we all laughed.
Well, because you know it's true. That's all. I wonder if the timber thing got ever sorted out. I mean, I had one foot out the door. I think Justin was still calling me. Hey, can we get this timber thing done?
We're still working on it. We may have to wait an administration or two. How about the last slide? The last photo here. That's a great photo of you.
Yes,
yeah. You like that one? Yeah.
That's good. A silver fox kind of thing.
I thought more of a touch of Clooney. Yeah?
I'll take that.
Okay.
He and I are the same age. George and I.
That's right.
Yeah.
As you look past your presidency, you've got at least 2 or 3 more decades. You've now launched, I understand, a new foundation.
Yeah.
What is the purpose and what are you trying to achieve?
Well, as I was preparing to leave office, I was 55 years old, so presumably have a third act. And I had to ask myself, what's my highest and best use? I always tell Malia and Sasha that most of my parental advice during the course of them growing up can be boiled down to 2 things. Be kind and be useful. I make it more complicated than that, but that's sort of what it comes down to. Treat other people well, with respect, the way you want to be treated, and do something useful. So I asked myself, what would be useful to other people. And there are a lot of issues that I care deeply about. I care deeply about climate change. I care deeply about inequality. I care deeply about international development. I'm concerned about women and girls making, having the same opportunities as men and boys do. But what I concluded was that when I charted all the issues that I dealt with across my presidency, most of the big problems we face not because we don't have pretty good answers, but we face because we're not organized to implement them. It's our politics, and it's our civics, and it's our leadership, or lack thereof. It's our inability to build consensus. And what I discovered as I was traveling around the world was that young people are deeply idealistic, incredibly gifted, innovators, want to change the world, but they don't trust the old institutions in the way they work. They're spiritual, but they don't oftentimes believe in the institutions of organized religion. They believe in that workers need a voice, but sometimes they feel as if the old forms of worker organizations aren't serving their realities. They believe in social change, but they think political parties aren't working. So what I said to Michelle is, let's create essentially a university for social change. Instead of just building a library that's looking backwards, let's create a hub that is training the next generation of leaders at every level, not just the folks who are going to the fancy colleges, but the young person who started a youth organization on a Native American reservation, a young woman who started a women's health clinic in a village in Kenya, a young man in the inner city who is working with ex-offenders to reintegrate them into society. Because if we train them, if we give them skills, support, financing, media training, spotlights, then they're the ones that are going to carry forward the solutions that we so desperately need. And if we can form a network of those young leaders, not just in the United States, but across the globe, then we got something. If we can train 1 million Baracks and Michelles, who are running around thinking that they can change the world, then we can get something going. So the foundation's focus is, we're going to have a presidential center in Chicago that will be sort of a campus, but that'll be the hub, and we'll have spokes connecting to university partners and nonprofit organizations and activist organizations around the world. And we will train young people to engage and get involved and lead, and then we'll place them and help support them in their various projects. So I'm pretty excited about it.
Fantastic work.
Yeah.